The Vikings didn't just raid, they farmed. Hidden in their fields were vegetables we've almost forgotten today. Hardy roots that fed them through brutal winters, greens that kept them strong at sea, and plants so tough they could grow where nothing else would. These Viking foods once kept warriors alive, and they might just need to make a comeback. The tale of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back begins not with feasts of gold or plunder, but with the humble soil beneath their boots. For all the glory sung of sails, swords, and raiding fire, it was the earth itself that guarded Viking life. Beneath the frost, hidden in furrows and ridges of dark ground, roots and greens clung to life when the seas raged and the skies offered no mercy. To forget these vegetables is to forget half of the Viking story, for without them no man could row, no child could grow, no woman could tend the hearth with strength enough to last through the endless winters. The land of the north was no gentle garden, its winds cut like blades, its summers were short and fleeting, its winters long enough to turn the marrow in one's bones to ice. Yet, it was in such harshness that the Vikings thrived, for they learned to draw nourishment from plants that modern tongues scarcely know by name. These were not soft vegetables, pampered by easy weather, but hard-won treasures that defied the cold and grew where hope seemed scarce. They were Viking food in its truest sense, unyielding, dependable, born of struggle, and rich with the taste of survival. The sagas tell us of kings and their halls, of warriors clashing in the shield wall, but seldom do they speak of the quiet miracle lying beneath a blanket of snow, roots that waited patiently through the frost, greens that dared to sprout when the air was still sharp with winter's bite. These vegetables were more than food, they were guardians of life. A Viking farmer, returning from the field, might dig through frozen ground to pull up Skirret, its sweetness a gift against hunger. A Viking mother might gather chickweed that grew unbidden along the paths, feeding her family with what others might dismiss as weeds. Such humble plants, forgotten today, carried the strength of empires in their leaves and roots. To eat them was to take in the land itself, to weave the spirit of earth and season into the body. Each plant told a story of winters endured, of fields tended in hardship, of feasts shared in dimly lit halls where laughter rose over steaming kettles. These forgotten vegetables were companions to the Viking table, roasted, stewed, boiled, baked, and sometimes eaten raw from the soil, their taste as much memory as sustenance. The richness of Viking food did not come from endless choice, but from the resilience of what the land gave, year after year, through storm and famine alike. In the stillness of long winter nights, when even the cattle grew thin and the sea gave no fish, these roots and greens were the difference between life and death. Skirret, Alexander's, good King Henry, and the rest, they were warriors of the earth, holding the line when hunger pressed close. They lacked the glory of gold, yet they were riches all the same, for without them the longships would have sailed empty and the sagas never sung. Now, as we uncover these forgotten vegetables, we are not merely recalling food, we are recalling the lifeblood of a people who endured when nature itself seemed their enemy. They are plants that deserve to rise again, for they carry within them the wisdom of centuries and the raw strength of survival. To walk the path of the Vikings is to honour not only their battles, but their bread, not only their kings, but their gardens, and not only their myths, but the roots that still wait beneath the frost. In the hard lands of the north, where soil was thin and frost never lingered far, one humble plant once held a place of honour at the Viking table. Skirret, the sweet root of the north, grew quietly beneath the earth, while storms howled above. It was no loud or boastful crop, but a patient one, multiplying in silence, feeding both the poor and the noble with its pale, slender roots. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few matched Skirret for its mix of sweetness, strength, and sheer reliability. To a Viking man setting out for sea, Skirret meant steady strength in his limbs, food that gave endurance without waste. To a Viking woman tending her hearth, the roots were a trusted friend, ready to roast in the coals, to stew with salted meat, or to mash into a dish for hungry mouths. Even a Viking child, sharp with hunger at the end of winter, knew the joy of biting into its tender flesh, softer and sweeter than any turnip or parsnip. Skirret was no mere food, it was a companion to survival. Unlike crops that demanded constant care, skirret needed little. Once planted, it returned year after year, a secret storehouse beneath the soil. Farmers called it a gift of patience, for it waited until hands came to dig it up. This made it precious in lean seasons when other fields lay bare. Its roots could be pulled fresh from the earth in winter, as though the ground itself offered mercy to those willing to dig. A Viking farmer knew that no matter the storm, skirret would still be waiting when the hunger pressed hardest. What made skirret beloved was not only its endurance, but its taste. Sweeter than carrots, with a softness that carried the faint richness of honey, it was prized at feasts as much as in humble huts. Saga songs speak of nobles demanding it for their gardens, for even kings valued its flavour. Yet, whether served on wooden trenchers in a smoky hall or in simple bowls before a family fire, skirret bound together rich and poor alike. It was a food that crossed all tables, a root that tasted of both luxury and survival. Its versatility was sung by every cook of the age. Roasted, it gave off a golden sweetness. Boiled, it melted into stews, blending with meat and barley. Fried in fat, it became crisp, fit for the high tables of jarls. There were even sweet pies and cakes shaped from its flesh, making it one of the few roots fit for celebration as well as hunger. In this way, skirret carried the spirit of Viking food, never wasted, always used, a warrior's ally and a farmer's friend. But as centuries turned, skirret's glory dimmed. Faster crops, larger roots, and easier harvests pushed it aside. The sweet root of the north, once treasured in Viking gardens, faded into the shadows of memory. Yet the soil remembers, and so do the sagas hidden between lines of feast and famine. Skirret was not only a crop, it was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that strength often grows in silence, hidden until it is needed most. To taste skirret again would be to taste the earth as the Vikings knew it, to bite into the sweetness that carried their people through frost and fire. Forgotten though it may be, this root deserves its return, for it is more than a vegetable, it is a fragment of the north itself, still waiting beneath the frost, ready to rise once more. When the long winter closed its grip on the north, when snow buried the fields and the wind roared like a wolf at the door, survival came not from sword or shield, but from what lay hidden beneath the frozen earth. Among the most faithful of these was skirret, the winter gift of the soil. Of all the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, none carried such quiet heroism in the face of famine. Skirret was more than a crop, it was a guardian, a lifeline waiting in silence until hunger drove rough hands to dig. The harshness of the north could break a man. A Viking farmer might see his barley wither in a sudden frost, his cabbages rot in the wet, his animals grow thin in the endless cold. Yet beneath the ground, the slender white roots of skirret endured. Frost could harden the earth, but it could not spoil what lay within. With nothing more than a spade, or even bare hands, families could draw food from the frozen soil. In a world where the difference between life and death was measured in days without bread, skirret was salvation. It was not a proud or showy plant. No towering stalks, no grand blooms to mark its worth. Instead, it offered resilience. A Viking man could trust that, even when his storehouse emptied, there would be skirret beneath the frost. A Viking woman, her children's stomachs aching with hunger, could dig in the cold and bring forth roots sweet enough to bring hope back to their faces. A Viking child, shivering in a smoky longhouse, might taste its soft flesh and know for a moment that the earth had not abandoned them. What set skirret apart from other roots was its constancy. Unlike grains that demanded careful tending, or fruits that vanished with the season, Skirret lingered, patient and plentiful. Even months into the deep cold, when most vegetables had long since rotted, its roots were still firm, still sweet, still nourishing. Old farming wisdom called it the poor man's comfort, for when all else failed, Skirret did not. It was the hidden ally of every Viking homestead, standing silently against hunger's cruel advance. And though it was born of need, it carried pleasure as well. Its taste was soft and sweet, richer than parsnip, gentler than carrot. Roasted on the hearth, it gave off warmth as though the earth itself had been captured in the flesh of a root. In stews it thickened the broth, in pies it became a rare winter delight. Even in famine, Skirret reminded Viking families that survival need not taste only of bitterness. It was proof that the gods, harsh though they were, had not left their people without kindness. The sagas seldom sing of such things, preferring blood and battle, yet in truth it was roots like Skirret that made the songs possible. Without them, the longships would not have sailed, the warriors would not have stood in the shield wall, the children would not have lived to grow into raiders, traders, and kings. Skirret was the unseen soldier of Viking food, fighting famine in silence, giving strength where strength was needed most. In time, it was forgotten, buried not by frost but by the march of new crops, new customs, new tongues. Yet, its story endures, whispering through the soil, waiting for those willing to remember. Skirret's winter gift was not merely nourishment. It was the promise that even in the darkest cold, life could still be drawn from the earth. It was a root that saved Viking lives, and perhaps, in its return, could remind us of the power that still sleeps beneath the frost. Long before the longships prowled distant coasts, before Viking axes rang out on foreign shores, another people had carried their own gifts into the north. Among them was a bold green plant, a legacy of Rome itself, that found root in Viking gardens and thrived in the rugged soil. Alexander's, they called it a herb and vegetable of many forms, tall and proud with yellow flowers that drew bees and men alike. Of all the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, Alexander's stands apart, for it was not born of the north, but adopted into it, welcomed as kin, and given a place of honour beside native crops. The Vikings prized what could endure, and Alexander's did not disappoint. It grew in wild thickets along coasts and cliffs, a sentinel against the wind, needing no tending to spring back each season. To the Viking farmer, this meant a plant that asked for nothing and gave everything. Its stems were eaten like celery, its leaves chopped into stews, its flowers scattered on the table, its seeds ground to spice bread and broth. Even its roots yielded nourishment, mild and steady, a gift that no part of the plant be wasted. Viking food was measured not in abundance, but in how fully it could be used, and in Alexander's, every piece had its place. What made it remarkable was not only its versatility, but its resilience. Where other greens withered in frost, Alexander's stood firm, its tall stalks a defiance of the northern chill. Viking men saw in it the strength of a comrade, always ready, never failing. Viking women gathered its shoots to flavour the kettle, knowing it would keep the taste of hunger at bay. Even a Viking child, chasing hens through the yard, might pause to chew its tender leaves, sharp and strange yet oddly sweet. The plant carried both vigour and boldness in its flavour, a reminder of lands beyond the sea, yet one that had become truly theirs. It is said the Romans brought Alexander's north in their march of empire, planting it in gardens as a soldier plants a standard. But while Rome's legions retreated, the plant remained, woven into the fabric of Norse life. In this way, it became a bridge between worlds. Roman legacy turned Viking strength. Though no sagas speak of it, its presence lingered in every village garden, in every field's edge, in every stew where its green leaves floated among meat and barley. There was a wildness to it too, a stubborn spirit that matched the Viking heart. Alexander's spread without restraint, seeding itself along paths and coastlines, claiming space where none had asked it to grow. Yet, instead of being cursed as weed, it was welcomed as ally. The Vikings admired what was untamed, and in Alexander's they found both utility and spirit. It grew tall, uninvited, like a warrior who joins the shield wall without summons, and proves his worth in the fight. But as centuries passed, Alexander's faded. Celery, softer and more easily shaped, took its place, and the bold green giant of the north slipped into obscurity. Yet the soil has not forgotten. Along wild cliffs and lonely paths, it still grows, waiting for those who know its name. In Alexander's, the Vikings found not just food, but a legacy of endurance, a Roman seed that thrived in Norse hands. To bring it back is not only to reclaim a vegetable, but to remember a time when strength was measured by what could weather the cold and rise again each spring. Alexander's was, and still is, a warrior among plants, unyielding, generous, and worthy of a place once more in the Viking garden. The strength of Alexander's was not in one part alone, but in the whole of it. To the Vikings, this bold green was a feast in itself, a plant that gave from root to flower, leaving nothing wasted. In an age when survival meant drawing every ounce of worth from soil and seed, Alexander's stood as a marvel. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, it was perhaps the most generous, a single plant offering many foods to fill the Viking table. The stems were the first gift. Tall and hollow, they were cut when tender and eaten fresh or boiled in the pot, their taste sharp like celery, but with a strength that lingered. Viking women prized them for thickening stews, for their flavour turned simple broth into a meal that warmed the bones. Even candied with honey, the stems became a treat to place before honoured guests in the hall. A Viking man returning from the sea could taste the green shoots and know the land still cared for him. The leaves, broad and deep green, gave their own bounty. Chopped into stews, crushed into pastes, or eaten raw when hunger pressed, they carried a bold taste, half parsley, half celery, but fiercer than both. In the lean months, when little else sprouted, the leaves of Alexander's filled the bowls of Viking children, keeping them strong while winter winds prowled. They were not delicate leaves for show, but hardy food, rich with the strength of earth, as fitting for warriors as for the hearth. The roots, though less known, were no less precious. Thick and pale, they were boiled or roasted, softening into a sweet flesh with hints of nut and earth. A Viking farmer, weary from the plough, might dig up the roots to roast beside his fire, their warmth seeping into tired hands. Unlike fleeting greens, the roots gave substance, the weight of true food that lasted long into the night. To eat them was to taste the endurance of the plant, its life hidden beneath the soil until called upon. The seeds were perhaps the most surprising treasure. Gathered and dried, they were ground into spice, their taste sharp and peppered, lending fire to Viking food when salt and smoke grew dull. The monks of the south prized pepper from distant lands, but the Vikings had Alexander's at their door, giving flavour enough to awaken any dish. A Viking woman sprinkling the crushed seeds into bread or ale gave her household a taste of warmth, even in the bleakest cold. And last, the flowers. Bright yellow, they lit the fields where Alexander's grew, but they were not only for the eye. Plucked and scattered, they adorned the Viking table, and in summer their presence drew bees to the hives, ensuring honey for the year. In this way, even the bloom of Alexander's was part of the feast, feeding man and creature alike. No part of the plant was idle, no piece unworthy. To a people who knew the weight of famine, Alexander's was a friend that offered all it had, and in return asked nothing but to grow. It was food for the noble and the poor, for the raider and the farmer, for the Viking child and the aging elder. To bring it back would be to restore not just a vegetable, but a philosophy of life, that nothing should be wasted, and that strength lies not in one gift, but in the gathering of many. Alexander's was such a gift, a feast of all parts, and its place at the Viking table deserves to be remembered. In the wild corners of the Viking world, where the soil was poor and the winters long, there grew a plant so humble in form, yet so mighty in worth, that it earned the name Good King Henry. No one knew why it bore a king's title, yet among the Vikings it ruled quietly as their own spinach of the north. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, this was among the most faithful, returning year after year, a steadfast green that gave strength when strength was needed most. Unlike tender crops that demanded care, Good King Henry was a warrior in its own right. It sprang from the earth with little tending, as if the gods themselves had sown it. A Viking man could cut it low and know it would return again the next season. A Viking woman, her hands cracked with cold, could gather its young shoots in spring and cook them like asparagus, while its older leaves filled stews with the vigour of spinach. Even a Viking child could recognize its hardy shape, plucking it from the yard to chew when hunger gnawed. It was not fragile, not fickle. It was the kind of plant the North needed, a survivor like its people. Its strength lay in more than flavour. Good King Henry carried the very metals of the earth in its veins. Rich in iron, it fed the blood, building warriors who could swing axe and oar with tireless arms. Laden with the strength of vitamins, it gave life to the weak and carried families through the lean weeks of spring, when the winter stores were gone and new crops had yet to ripen. For the Vikings, it was no mere green leaf, but a cure for the body's exhaustion, a shield against the pale weakness of hunger. The plant was not only food, but medicine. The wise women and healers brewed its roots into a drink that eased the stomach and crushed its leaves to lay upon wounds. Folk called it all good, for there seemed no ailment it could not soothe. A Viking farmer could harvest it to feed his family. A Viking healer could use it to mend his people, and both knew it would never abandon them. The plant's loyalty was as sure as the return of the sun after winter. In the longhouses of the north, its taste was simple yet vital. In stews it mingled with barley and salted meat, softening the harshness of the pot with a green freshness. Its buds, small and clustered, could be cooked like tiny cabbages, while the shoots filled the belly with the promise of new life after the famine of winter. There was a joy in its arrival each spring, as if the land itself announced, "You have endured, and now you shall be fed again." Yet for all its gifts, Good King Henry faded from memory. As the centuries turned, richer soils and softer crops took its place, and the Viking spinach was left behind, remembered only in scraps of old lore. But in its time, it was a king, indeed a ruler, not of crowns and halls, but of gardens and hearths, of life renewed when all seemed lost. To bring it back would be to taste again the resilience of the Viking spirit, a plant that, like its people, asked little and gave much. Good King Henry was a quiet sovereign of the north, and though forgotten, its reign is not ended. It waits still in the soil, ready to rise and feed those who seek its strength once more. Good King Henry was no ordinary green. In the hard world of the north, where every plant was tested by frost and famine, this humble herb became both healer and provider. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, none embodied the Viking way of life more completely than this plant, for it gave not only food but medicine, not only nourishment but strength. Where others failed, it endured, and where bodies faltered, it restored them. A Viking man who marched to battle with axe in hand owed more than he knew to Good King Henry. Its iron-rich leaves fed his blood, giving him the vigour to row the longship or swing steel in the shield wall. When wounds tore his flesh, its crushed leaves could be bound against the skin, drawing out infection, soothing pain, and hastening the mending of torn muscle. The Viking warrior's blade was iron, and so too was the leaf that sustained him, both forged by the same earth. To the Viking woman, Good King Henry was a quiet ally at the hearth. Its young shoots served as tender greens in spring, boiled or fried like asparagus, giving her family strength when stores ran thin. The mature leaves, darker and sturdier, became a poor man's spinach, filling pots with nourishment when meat was scarce. Even the flower buds had their place, plucked and boiled like tiny cabbages to feed hungry mouths. From one plant, she could prepare a dozen dishes, each as valuable as gold in the lean months. And when sickness struck her household, she turned to its roots for teas that eased the stomach and cleansed the blood. The Viking child, small and sharp-eyed, grew up knowing its worth as well. For him, it was not merely a green leaf, but proof that the earth still gave gifts, even after the long dark of winter. Its taste was the taste of survival, a memory he would carry into manhood, remembering how good King Henry had kept hunger at bay when nothing else would grow. What made the plant remarkable was its constancy. Once sown, it returned year after year, without demanding new seed or endless toil. It was a perennial ally, as reliable as the return of spring itself. To the Vikings, who understood the harsh turns of fate better than most, such reliability was more precious than beauty or speed. A crop that never abandoned its people was as valued as a comrade who never fled in battle. Even the healers, the wise folk who read the whispers of herbs and roots, knew good King Henry's power. Its leaves, applied to wounds, drew out poison. Its juices cooled burns. Its roots, brewed into tea, loosened the bowels when sickness bound them, or steadied the belly when too much salt meat and ale had brought pain. It was not simply a vegetable, but a living apothecary in the Viking garden, a medicine chest rooted in the soil. In the feasting halls, its role was quieter than mead or meat, yet no less vital. While roasted boar and rich stews drew cheers, it was the green leaves of good King Henry that kept warriors from falling ill, that steadied their blood, that filled the gaps left by hard winters. It was the silent strength behind the songs, the unseen hand that allowed feasts to continue when famine lurked outside. Though forgotten now, this plant once bore the weight of Viking survival, healer and provider. It gave freely to all who sought its aid. To bring it back is to honour the wisdom of the past, to remember that true kingship lies not in crowns or thrones, but in constancy, in the quiet giving of life. Good King Henry was such a sovereign ruler of gardens, guardian of health, and steadfast companion of the Viking people. There was a root in the Viking age that seemed almost a trick of the gods, a plant pulled from the soil yet tasting of the sea. This was salsify, the strange root that carried the flavour of oysters, though it had never touched salt water. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few held such mystery, for it was both food and symbol, a gift of the earth that echoed the ocean, binding land and sea together in a single bite. To the Viking man, who had rowed long upon cold waters, the taste of salsify brought the sea to his lips, even when far from shore. To the Viking woman tending her cooking fire, its roots were a treasure to soften with boiling or roasting, their flesh yielding a delicate sweetness with a whisper of the tide. Even a Viking child, chewing its tender pieces, might dream of fish and waves, though he had never left the farmstead. It was a food that seemed to carry the memory of salt spray within it, a marvel from the ground. Its strangeness made it more than a common crop. In times of fasting, when the church forbade the eating of meat or fish, salsify became a sacred food. It gave the taste of the sea without the taking of flesh, and so it filled bowls in monasteries as well as homes. A Viking monk might note its value in quiet records, while a Viking farmer dug it up as needed, knowing the root could lie safe in the ground through the deepest cold. In this way, it became both holy food and hunger's relief, honoured by men of the cross and men of the axe alike. The root itself was not handsome. Long and thin, its dark skin clung tight, hiding the pale flesh within. Yet the Vikings knew not to trust appearances. Beneath its rough surface lay a flavour unlike any other, a mingling of earth and sea that no other plant could match. Boiled, it softened into tender sweetness. Roasted, it gave a richness that could turn a humble meal into feast. It was proof that the gods loved to play with the senses, hiding delicacy in plain soil. Through winter it shone brightest. When cabbages rotted and fields lay barren, Salsify waited beneath frost, untouched by the cold. A Viking woman could dig through snow, bring it forth, and set it upon her table as though spring had returned. It stored well in cellars, lasting months when little else endured. In the famine times, when children cried at night and men's faces grew hollow, the root that tasted of the sea brought strength back to the people. For the Vikings, who balanced always between feast and famine, battle and prayer, Salsify was more than sustenance. It was a reminder that the earth could give wonders equal to the sea, that the line between land and water was not so firm as men thought. To eat it was to taste the meeting of two worlds, the field and the fjord, the plough and the oar. Now it lies forgotten, pushed aside by swifter crops and fairer roots. Yet, in its day, Salsify was a marvel of Viking food, a sacred fasting meal, a winter guardian, a treasure hidden in the soil. To bring it back would be to restore not just a vegetable, but a taste of the north itself, the sea caught in the flesh of a root, the memory of waves lingering in the hearth of every Viking hall. When the frost tightened its grip on the north, when the fields lay buried under snow and the sea lashed the coast with iron winds, few foods endured. But hidden beneath the frozen earth, the slender roots of Salsify waited like buried treasure. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, this strange root was a winter guardian, giving life when other crops had long surrendered to the cold. To a Viking man returning from the hunt empty-handed, Salsify was hope. He could take his spade to the frozen soil, and though his breath smoked in the air and his fingers stiffened, he knew the roots would be there, firm and sweet beneath the frost. To a Viking woman guarding her family's hearth, it was salvation. She could dig through the snow, gather what the soil still offered, and place before her children a meal that softened the gnaw of hunger. For the Viking child, pale from lean months, a bowl of steaming Salsify was warmth in the belly, proof that the land had not turned its back. What made Salsify precious was its endurance. Where other vegetables withered, it held fast. The earth itself seemed to preserve it, keeping it fresh until hands came to lift it free. Unlike grain that rotted in damp stores, or meat that vanished too soon, the root remained faithful in the ground, month after month. In this way, it became not just food but a storehouse, a living larder that waited silently for those in need. The Vikings understood the value of such a gift. Winter was always a test, when even the strong faltered and the weak faded away. Yet Salsify endured without care, without tending, without complaint. A Viking farmer might see his cabbages collapse under rot, his beans shrivel, his turnips hollow, but he could still trust the Salsify. In the leanest years, when famine shadowed the land, this root became the difference between death and endurance. And it was no meagre fare. Though plain in form, Salsify carried a taste that belied its appearance. Soft when boiled, golden when roasted, it gave off a sweetness mingled with the strange flavour of oysters, a hint of the sea in the heart of the earth. This made it more than mere fuel, it was comfort in the dark. To eat it was to remember summer feasts, to taste richness, even in times of want. Viking food was seldom lavish, yet in Salsify they found something rare, nourishment that pleased both body and spirit. The wise among them praised it not only as food, but as medicine. Its roots eased the stomach, calmed fevers, and gave strength back to those weakened by long hunger. Monks in their cloisters grew it as a sacred crop for fasting days, but the farmer's family valued it more deeply still, for it filled the bowls of their children when the nights grew longest. It was a humble saviour, silent and unseen, yet it stood beside the Viking people as firmly as any comrade in battle. Its endurance was their endurance, its strength their strength. Without it, the shield wall might have faltered, the longships never launched, the sagas never sung. Now it lies forgotten, but the soil remembers. In the days of the Vikings, salsify was the treasure of winter hunger, the faithful root that did not betray when all else failed. To restore it would be to call back a companion of survival, a food that proved even in the darkest frost, life still slept beneath the earth, waiting to be claimed. Among the strangest treasures of the Viking garden was the medlar, a fruit that defied both eye and hand. At first sight, it seemed a mockery of food, hard, bitter, and shaped in a way that drew crude names from the mouths of farmers. Yet patience turned this wrinkled fruit into sweetness, and the Vikings, ever skilled at waiting for the right season, made of it a feast. Of the forgotten vegetables, Vikings grew that need to come back. None better showed the virtue of endurance than the medlar, the fruit that ripened not on the branch, but in time itself. Fresh from the tree, the medlar was no gift. Its flesh was stone-hard, its taste sharp and foul, enough to twist the face of any Viking child bold enough to bite too soon. But those who knew its ways did not curse it. Instead, they laid it down and waited, letting frost and air soften its stubborn flesh. This slow change, called bletting, transformed the fruit from bitterness to sweetness, from mockery to treasure. What once seemed rot became delicacy, and the Vikings, who knew well the worth of patience in long winters, gave it a place at their tables. For a Viking man, weary from sea or battle, the medlar was a rare indulgence. Its flesh, soft as spiced applesauce, carried a taste both rich and strange, sweet with the sharpness of the earth. For a Viking woman, it was a fruit that could be turned to many uses, mashed into tarts, boiled into jellies, fermented into wine. Even a Viking child, wide-eyed with hunger, would delight in the strange, mushy pulp, savouring it as though it were honey drawn from the comb. The fruit's greatest gift was its timing. Ripening late in the autumn, it came when other fruits were long gone, when the orchards stood bare and the land offered little. In those darkening months, when hunger grew, as the days shrank, the medlar gave a sweetness that carried families toward winter's heart. And, unlike berries or apples, it lasted. Stored carefully, it could remain edible for weeks, offering rare fruit when snow lay deep and the nights grew long. There was symbolism in it too. The medlar taught patience, reminding the Vikings that not all things revealed their worth at once. Some treasures required waiting, trust, and endurance. Just as a Viking farmer sowed seed in spring with faith in harvest months away, so too did he set aside the medlar, knowing that rot itself could be turned into feast. Though not as common as roots or greens, it held its place in noble gardens and humble farms alike. Monks prized it for wines and preserves, while households set them upon shelves, watching as the weeks turned them soft and sweet. It was a fruit of transformation, a lesson that beauty lay not in form, but in what time could make of it. Yet the medlar, like so many foods of the Old North, faded into obscurity. Modern tongues turned away from its wrinkled face, seeking fruits that were quick to please and fair to the eye. But the Vikings had seen through such illusions. They knew that beneath the rough and the ugly, the strange and the slow, there could lie a treasure fit for feast and fire. To restore the medlar would be to restore more than a fruit. It would be to reclaim the wisdom of patience, to taste again the sweetness that only waiting can bring. In the halls of the north, where long winters tested every soul, the medlar was more than food. It was a promise that what seemed bitter and broken could yet be made sweet, if only one had the strength to endure. In the shadowed halls of winter, when the wind clawed at the timbers and the long night pressed heavy on the land, the Vikings turned to feasting as both shield and comfort. The fire roared, horns brimmed with mead, and platters of roasted meat passed from hand to hand. Yet among these heavier foods there was one strange fruit that lent the feast a touch of wonder, the medlar. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back. Few carried such an odd face, and yet such an honoured place in the noble gatherings of the north. To the eye, the medlar seemed unworthy of the table. Wrinkled, brown, and split at its base, it bore more likeness to decay than to delicacy. But the Vikings had learned its secret. Time was its ripener. Left to blet, the medlar's flesh softened into a dark, sweet pulp, rich with flavour that no other fruit could match. And it was this very strangeness that made it fit for feasts. Where roasted boar and salted fish brought strength, the medlar brought surprise, a sweetness born from patience, a luxury few lands could rival in the cold months. Imagine the long table in a chieftain's hall. Viking men, their beards frosted with winter air, laughed and struck cups together. Viking women, seated in honour, passed bowls heavy with meat and barley. A Viking child sat wide-eyed, watching flames flicker against the carved beams overhead. And at the end of the meal, when bellies were filled and voices softened with mead, the medlars were brought forth. Their wrinkled shells hid their treasure, and when their flesh was scooped and eaten, it seemed as though the very taste of autumn had been captured and preserved against the snow. For the nobles, it was a mark of wealth to serve medlars. Not every farm grew them, and their patience-demanding ripening meant that only those with stores and forethought could bring them to table. Yet the fruit's rarity was matched by its adaptability. In the kitchens, Viking women stewed it into spiced pastes, folded it into pies, or brewed it into sweet wines. Its consistency was soft and rich, turning even the simplest bread into a dessert fit for lords. The medlar gave the feasting table a touch of refinement, a reminder that even in the harshest months, life could still hold sweetness. But it was not only taste that earned its place. The medlar carried symbolism. In its ugliness turned to richness, it mirrored the Viking view of struggle. From hardship, strength was born. From rot, sweetness. From long waiting, reward. To eat medlars in winter was to taste the lesson that the north itself taught. Endurance brings treasure. It was a fruit not just of the tongue, but of the spirit. In some feasts, the medlar was even offered last, a closing note to the night. After meat, after mead, after song, the soft sweetness lingered, a reminder of the gifts that could be drawn from the land even when all seemed barren. Its odd form invited jest, its strange ripening brought marvel, and its flavour sealed the memory of the gathering. Though forgotten now, the medlar once held a place beside the greatest dishes of the Viking feast. It was a fruit of patience, a noble delicacy of the dark months, a sign that even in the frozen north, the earth still gave surprises. To restore it would be to restore a piece of the old hall, where laughter and fire rose against the night, and the wrinkled fruit of patience sweetened the hearts of the Viking people. It crept along the edges of Viking fields, tangled itself in paths, and pushed stubbornly through cracks in stone walls. Chickweed was no noble crop, no carefully tended green. It was an uninvited guest in the gardens of the north, sprouting without summons, spreading without mercy. Yet while other farmers might curse its persistence, the Vikings welcomed it. For in this humble weed lay a gift that often meant the difference between hunger and survival. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, chickweed is perhaps the most overlooked, a weed that proved itself worthy of the Viking table. A Viking man knew the worth of strength, whether in battle or in the earth. Chickweed had that strength in abundance. It grew in every soil, in every season but the deepest freeze, and yielded its tender leaves in great numbers. To a Viking farmer, weary from the plough, chickweed was food that demanded no sowing, no tending, no harvest, beyond the simple gathering of what the land already gave. It was nature's charity, and the wise did not spurn such gifts. For the Viking woman keeping watch over the hearth, it was a green she could always rely upon. When stores of cabbage and skirret dwindled, when dried fish and barley grew thin, she could step outside and gather handfuls of chickweed. Its leaves, mild and pleasant, found their way into stews, broths, and breads. turning thin meals into feasts rich with freshness. Even raw, its tender shoots carried a clean, cooling taste, welcome after the salt and smoke of winter provisions. It was the food that asked for nothing but gave everything, as if the gods had sown it themselves to keep famine at bay. The Viking child, often hungry in the lean months, came to know its creeping stems as well. Many learned to pluck it from the ground and chew it straight, savouring the small burst of green life amid the cold grey days. To the young, it was proof that even in scarcity, the earth still whispered kindness. But chickweed was more than nourishment, it was healer as well. The wise women of the villages crushed its leaves into poultices to soothe burns and rashes, brewed it into teas to cool fevered brows, and mixed it into remedies that calmed the swell of inflamed joints. Its spirit was gentle but powerful, a soft weed that carried the strength to mend. In this way, it bound itself not only to the Viking table, but also to the Viking heart, as both food and medicine. Its abundance was its true gift. Where others saw nuisance, the Vikings saw salvation. Chickweed grew faster than it could be plucked, spreading in carpets across gardens and roadsides, making waste places fruitful. It was the weed that turned famine into survival, the intruder that proved itself ally. In the balance of life and hunger, such a plant was no curse but a blessing, a hidden warrior in the quiet war against starvation. And so, though never sung in sagas nor praised in high feasts, chickweed held its place in the lives of the North. It was not grand like the medlar, not strange like Salsify, not bold like Alexander's, but it was constant, faithful, and free. In its humble leaves, the Vikings found the quiet assurance that even in the harshest land, life insists on growing. To bring chickweed back to our tables would be to remember that not all gifts come with beauty or ceremony. Some arrive uninvited, creeping in shadows, yet bearing more worth than fields of gold. Chickweed was such a guest, unexpected, unstoppable, and utterly essential to the survival of Viking families. In the harsh north, where cold winds burned the skin and hunger gnawed the belly, healing often came not from the hands of kings, but from the humblest of plants. Chickweed, the creeping green that grew unbidden in every Viking field and pathway, carried within it powers that reached beyond the table. It was not only food, but medicine, a quiet ally in the endless battle against sickness, wounds, and famine. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few carried such a dual blessing nourishment for the body and cure for its ills. The Viking man who returned from sea, his body sore from rowing, and his skin raw from salt and cold, knew the worth of chickweed. Its crushed leaves, laid upon the flesh, cooled the burns of wind and water. A Viking woman, guiding her household through fever's grip, brewed its leaves into teas that eased the heat and steadied the breath. Even the Viking child, thin from the bite of hunger, could chew the tender shoots and feel strength trickle back into his blood. What others cursed as a weed, the North knew as a healer. Its power lay in its gentleness. Chickweed soothed where other herbs burned, calmed where harsher remedies stung. The wise women of the villages praised it for drawing fire from wounds, for cooling skin plagued by rashes and sores. Poultices of the plant were laid across inflamed joints, and its juices eased the sting of bites and boils. In every homestead, when the body cried out in pain, chickweed was the green that answered softly, bringing relief without cruelty. But its healing was not of the skin alone. In times of famine, when storehouses emptied and bellies shrank, chickweed fed the body with more than comfort. Rich in strength, it gave what few other plants could in the long months of scarcity: iron for the blood, oils for the flesh, and a freshness that revived weary limbs. A Viking farmer might watch his fields fail, yet still gather armfuls of chickweed from the ground between furrows, turning despair into a meal. It was food born of necessity, yet one that carried the taste of mercy. In the halls of the sick, its name was whispered with respect. When fevers burned too hot and a man's strength faltered, chickweed teas cooled the fire within. When children's faces paled from want, its leaves filled their mouths with green vitality. When warriors carried wounds from battle, its poultices aided the slow knitting of skin and sinew. It was not the herb of glory, not sung in sagas beside sword or spear, but it was the herb that let the sagas continue at all. Chickweed's gift was its abundance. It needed no tending, no coaxing, no guard. It appeared where it pleased, in corners of the field, at the edges of homes, beside paths trodden by oxen and men. To the unwise, this made it a nuisance. To the Vikings, it made it a constant companion. When hunger, fever, or wounds struck, they knew the earth would offer chickweed freely, without demand, without end. And so it earned its place not in glory but in gratitude. It was the plant that soothed the flesh, fed the weak, and gave quietly when the world seemed most cruel. Forgotten now, it waits still in the shadows, uninvited yet essential, carrying within it the memory of Viking resilience. To bring chickweed back is to restore not only food, but a healer of the Old North, a green ally that once guarded the people through frost, fire, and famine. In the lore of the Viking age, not all treasures were gold or silver, nor were all weapons forged of steel. Some were drawn from the soil itself, roots that carried both nourishment and mystery. Among these was scorzonera, the black-skinned root known as the snake root. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few were held in such curious esteem, for the Vikings believed it could draw venom from the blood and save a man from death's grip. And even when no snake's bite threatened, its flesh gave sweetness enough to earn a place at their table. The name alone carried power. To a Viking man venturing into forests or fields where serpents stirred, the very thought of scorzonera was a shield. Legends claimed that its juice could pull poison from wounds, that its flesh could cleanse a body stricken by venom. Wise women boiled its roots into draughts for those fevered and bitten, laying faith in the earth's cure as surely as others laid faith in the gods. Whether truth or not, the belief gave courage, and in a world where danger lay in every shadow, that courage was itself a kind of medicine. Yet scorzonera was more than remedy, it was food, and food of rare quality. Beneath its black skin lay a pale flesh, tender and sweet, carrying the faint taste of nuts and the richness of earth. Roasted, it softened into golden strands. Boiled, it melted into stews, eaten plain. It filled the belly with a mild sweetness that calmed hunger's sharp edge. A Viking woman, stirring her pot in the longhouse, would prize its roots as both sustenance and healing. A Viking child, wide-eyed with hunger, would chew its softness and feel warmth return to his thin frame. The plant was valued not only for its flavour, but for its endurance. Pulled in autumn, its roots could be kept through the long winter, stored in cool sand where they remained fresh until the sun returned. For the Viking farmer, this meant food that did not fade with the season, food that could be trusted when snow lay deep and famine pressed close. It was not just a crop, but a promise, a steadfast ally against hunger's cruelty. The wise men of the time spoke of it as a purifier of blood, a cleanser of the stomach, a healer of sickness. Though they knew little of herbs beyond what experience taught, they saw in scorzonera a plant that gave both vigour and relief. To the Vikings, whose lives were forged in struggle, such a gift was worth more than beauty. They cared less for how a plant looked, and more for how it endured, how it healed, how it fed. And scorzonera did all three. In the feasting halls, when salted meats and heavy bread filled the table, scorzonera added balance. Its sweet nut-like taste lightened the pot, gave contrast to the salt and fat, and reminded all that the earth gave gifts equal to the sea and field. It was a quiet treasure, not sung of in sagas, but known in every homestead where survival was measured in roots and leaves as much as in steel and song. Though time has pushed it aside, Scorzonera once stood as the Vikings' snake root, a plant of fear and faith, of healing and hunger's relief. To bring it back is to honor that bond with the soil, to remember that even in the harshest of lands, the earth gave its people weapons against famine and foes alike. Sweet flesh hidden in black skin, Scorzonera was a root of mystery and mercy, a true companion of the Viking world. When the fields turned bare and the long dark pressed its weight upon the land, survival for the Vikings was never measured in days of plenty, but in how long food could endure. It was in such seasons that Scorzonera revealed its secret strength. This black-skinned root, plain to the eye yet rich within, became a guardian of Viking survival. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few carried such quiet power, for Scorzonera gave not only sweetness to the tongue but also endurance to the body, lasting through the harshest trials of the year. The Viking man knew that harvest was only the beginning of struggle. Grain could rot, fish could spoil, and meat once salted still diminished with every passing month. But Scorzonera, pulled from the soil in autumn, could be buried in cool earth or sand and kept fresh until summer's return. In a world without stone cellars or iron locks against decay, this was no small miracle. It was as though the root itself chose to wait with the people, lying patient and ready, a steadfast ally against famine. For the Viking woman who kept watch over her stores, Scorzonera was a food she could trust. Its long roots held firm against time, and when brought forth in the depth of winter, they tasted as fresh as the day they had been pulled from the earth. She could boil them into stews thick with barley, roast them beside strips of salted meat, or mash them into soft dishes for children whose teeth could not yet bite hard fare. Even in months when nothing new grew, Scorzonera gave the gift of freshness, a flavour that revived the weary spirit. To the Viking child, thin from long hunger, Scorzonera's flesh was more than food, it was hope. Its sweetness brought comfort to the tongue, its warmth filled the belly, and its endurance meant there would be something to eat tomorrow as well as today. Children grew strong because their mothers could reach into storage and find, even in the harshest month, the pale roots waiting, unspoiled and full of life. Its strength lay not only in taste but in constancy. Other plants were fleeting, cabbages rotted, apples shriveled, beans dried to hardness. Scorzonera stood apart. It kept the earth's promise, feeding families across the long gap between harvest and planting. A Viking farmer who placed trust in Scorzonera knew his household had a companion in the battle against the endless cold. It was not loud in its gifts, but steady, the kind of ally most valued when the nights stretched longest. And there was healing in it too. The wise among the Vikings said its roots calmed the belly and purified the blood, restoring those who had grown weak with hunger or sickness. A man who had seen too many lean days could be given Scorzonera broth and feel strength return to his limbs. A woman worn by toil found her body eased by its gentle properties. It was not only a root to fill the pot, but a medicine hidden beneath black skin. In truth, Scorzonera was a warrior of the soil, its armour dark and rough, its heart pale and sweet. It guarded the Vikings in silence, carrying them through seasons when even the strong faltered. Forgotten now, it waits still, a reminder that true strength lies not in show but in endurance. To bring back Scorzonera would be to bring back the memory of a food that kept the north alive, a quiet root that bore the weight of survival through winter's long siege. Amid the frost and shadow of the north, when gardens withered and fields slept beneath snow, there was one green that defied the season. The Vikings called it their steadfast companion, though the world knew it by a stranger's name, Welsh onion. Neither of Wales nor holy onion, it mattered little to those who tended the land. What mattered was its constancy. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, none lived up to its promise so faithfully, for Welsh onions returned year after year, a living thread of green that bound together the Viking homestead. For the Viking man, weary from sea or field, the sight of its shoots rising from cold soil was a comfort. When other crops demanded sowing and patience, Welsh onions simply returned, stubborn as stone, refusing to vanish even under frost. He could cut them down, gather their hollow stalks for the pot, and know that the plant would rise again. In this way, it mirrored the Viking spirit itself, knocked down by storm or steel, yet never broken, always returning. For the Viking woman, keeper of hearth and board, Welsh onions were a gift that spared both time and toil. Their green shoots flavoured her stews, her broths, her salted fish. Their sharpness cut through the heaviness of winter meals, brightening the taste of barley gruel or boiled meat. Unlike crops that yielded once and were gone, Welsh onions multiplied, forming clumps that spread like family across the soil. With a single planting, she could feed her household for years, perhaps even pass the same patch to her children. Such bounty was a rare treasure in a land where survival was never guaranteed. Even the Viking child grew up knowing its worth. In the bleak months when little else was green, Welsh onions offered something fresh to bite. Their flavour was sharp enough to wrinkle a young face, yet to hungry mouths they were welcome all the same. Children played in the yard where the onions grew and learned that this was food they could always find, a lesson in endurance written in the garden itself. What made Welsh onions beloved was not only their taste, but their resilience. They braved the cold with a stubbornness few other plants possessed. In many corners of the north, they stayed green through winter's chill, offering life when the world seemed barren. In lean months, this was no small miracle. A Viking farmer could step outside, brush snow from the ground, and still cut the onion's shoots. Few foods granted such loyalty. The plant was also healer as much as food. Its juices were said to stir the blood, sharpen the senses, and ward against sickness. The wise women laid it into poultices for wounds, or brewed it into drinks for the fevered. To the Vikings, whose lives were filled with battle, labour, and cold, such a plant was a gift of the gods themselves. Though forgotten now, Welsh onions once stood as a quiet pillar of Viking food. Not Welsh, not wholly onion, yet truer to the north than many crops born there, it was a green that gave endlessly and asked for nothing. To restore it would be to restore a piece of the Viking hearth, the eternal green that endured frost, famine, and the turning of generations. In its shoots lived the same spirit that filled the people of the north, unyielding, faithful, eternal. When winter laid its iron hand upon the north, and the nights stretched long, Viking families knew the true measure of their food stores. Barrels of fish grew empty, grain bins echoed hollow, and salted meat became thin slices guarded like treasure. It was in these lean months, when hunger crept into every hall, that Welsh onions proved themselves a hidden ally. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, none better showed how quiet endurance could guard a people against despair. The Viking man, returning from days of fishing on a sea that gave no catch, might have felt defeat in his bones. Yet, stepping into his yard, he could brush aside snow and see the green shoots of Welsh onions rising stubbornly from the frozen earth. Their taste was sharp, their body slight, but in that moment they were salvation. A handful of stalks, cut and added to a thin broth, turned water and barley into a meal that warmed the belly and heart. For the Viking woman, watching over a household in the dark of February, Welsh onions were the food that kept her family alive when nothing else grew. She knew their constancy. Once planted, they multiplied and endured, clumping together like kin who refused to abandon one another. Year after year, through storms and frost, the onions returned. She needed no new seed, no fresh planting, only the wisdom to gather and to wait. In a world where famine was never far, this green was as steady as the fire in her hearth. The Viking child, his ribs showing through thin skin after months of salted fare, tasted in the onions a freshness his tongue had nearly forgotten. Their sharp bite carried the memory of summer fields, of warmth and growth, even as snow pressed heavy on the roof. To chew on the hollow stalks was to believe, if only for a moment, that spring would come again. For the young, it was not just food, it was hope sprouting from the frozen soil. Welsh onions carried a strength that belied their humble form. They thrived where others failed, standing green when gardens lay bare, when the ground itself seemed dead. Their shoots, hollow and crisp, were a rare source of life when the air still reeked of smoke and hunger. No wonder the Vikings cherished them, for they asked little and gave much. In those months of scarcity, the onion's gift was more than taste. It was endurance, proof that the land had not wholly abandoned its people. Even the healers valued it beyond the table. Its juices were said to drive away sickness, to cleanse wounds, and to strengthen weary blood. In the long dark, when fever could sweep through a household like fire, the onion was pressed into service as medicine as well as meal. Thus, it stood doubly as guardian, curing, feeding, and enduring. It was never the centerpiece of a feast, never sung of in saga or carved into runes, yet it was present in every Viking homestead, working in silence while greater foods vanished. In truth, it was the humble ally that made the great feasts possible. For without Welsh onions to carry families through the lean months, there might have been no warriors strong enough to fight, no children strong enough to grow, no households left to celebrate when the sun returned. Forgotten now, its gift remains buried in history. But in the age of the Vikings, Welsh onions were more than a green. They were a promise, an eternal flame of the soil, small yet unyielding, keeping the people alive through hunger's cruel season. They were the hidden ally of the north, the quiet saviour of countless winters. In the wind-swept fields of the north, where soil was thin and the poor man's hands were calloused from toil, there grew a plant that asked for no planting, no tending, no gift of seed. It was called fat hen, and though it spread like a weed, the Vikings knew it for what it truly was, a feast for the poor. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, fat hen holds a place of quiet honour, for it fed both man and beast, carrying families through hunger when other crops failed. A Viking man, bent with the weight of labour, could look to his furrows and find them bare, grain withered, barley stunted, turnips thin and weak. Yet along the edges of the field, in the corners where no plough reached, fat hen sprang forth in green abundance. Its leaves, rich and tender, offered food that rivaled spinach in strength and surpassed it in richness. What nature gave freely, the wise did not scorn. The poor man gathered it in armfuls, filling his kettle with nourishment that no lord could tax. To the Viking woman, guardian of the hearth, fat hen was a gift she did not need to sow. She boiled its leaves like spinach, stirred them into stews, and dried them for later use. When the stores ran thin, it gave her children fresh food in the heart of famine. Even its seeds, small and black, could be ground into flour to bake rough bread, a bitter but life-saving meal when grain was gone. In the hard months, fat hen became the difference between a thin broth and a meal that gave strength enough to see another day. The Viking child, often sharp with hunger, came to know the taste of its leaves well. He chewed them raw as he walked the fields, plucking from the earth what others might trample underfoot. Though simple in flavour, it carried life in every bite. For the young, it was a weed-turned friend, proof that the gods had not wholly abandoned them in their need. Its name came not only from the fullness it gave to men, but also to beasts, fed to hens and livestock. It fattened them quickly, giving more meat, more eggs, more milk. Thus fat hen served the household doubly food for the people, fodder for the animals that sustained them. A Viking farmer could watch his cattle grow stronger, his hens grow plump, and know that this weed was as valuable as any crop he had sown. Though never gracing the high tables of jarls, fat hen was the companion of the peasant, the ally of the poor. Its richness was hidden not in beauty or prestige, but in the quiet power of its leaves, packed with strength enough to nourish warriors, farmers, and children alike. It was a plant of resilience, thriving in the margins, uninvited but always welcome. In the sagas, no skald sang of fat hen, yet its spirit runs beneath their words. For without such humble food, the warriors would not have stood in the shield wall, nor the ships rode through storm, nor the people endured the endless winters. It was the unseen root of Viking survival, the weed that became feast, the green that turned famine into life. Forgotten now, fat hen waits as it always has, springing up where no one thinks to look. To bring it back is to remember that strength often grows unbidden, and that sometimes the poorest man's feast is the truest wealth of all. When the skies withheld their mercy, and the fields of the north lay barren, the Vikings entered what they called the Hunger Years. It was in such cruel seasons, when grain shriveled and livestock grew gaunt, that fat hen rose from the earth as if the gods themselves had sown it. This weed, often trampled underfoot, became the saviour of the poor. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, fat hen's role in famine was among the greatest, for it turned despair into survival and gave breath to those who might otherwise have perished. The Viking man, lean from hunger and worn by toil, would walk through fields stripped of barley and rye. Yet even in such desolation, fat hen stood green at the edges, sprouting defiantly from soil too poor for other crops. With hands that once gripped oar or spear, he gathered its leaves, knowing they carried more strength than many finer foods. Though not the feast of nobles, it was the feast of survival, a wild harvest that filled his belly when hunger had hollowed it. The Viking woman, keeper of life within the longhouse, understood fat hen's power better than any. She boiled its leaves like spinach, served them raw in humble bowls, or dried them for use when times grew harsher still. But when stores of grain vanished, it was the seeds of fat hen that proved most precious. Small and black, they could be ground into coarse flour and baked into bread. The loaves were dark, bitter, and heavy, yet they carried enough strength to keep her children alive through the famine months. In the glow of the hearth, she set the rough bread before them, and in their eyes she saw not joy, but relief, the kind of relief that meant one more day of life. For the Viking child, too young to understand the weight of hunger, fat hen was a strange salvation. They chewed its raw leaves, tart but filling, and ate the rough bread their mothers baked. Though thin and weary, they endured, and those who lived carried the memory of this humble plant into adulthood, remembering how it had saved their lives when no other food could be found. Fat hen's strength was not only in its nourishment, but in its abundance. It needed no ploughing, no sowing, no tending. It appeared in every patch of ground, in waste places and paths, in the corners of gardens where other crops failed. When famine stripped away the riches of field and farm, fat hen grew untouched, multiplying where despair thought it had won. This constancy made it more than food. It became a silent promise from the earth that life would not wholly abandon the Vikings. The wise women knew its worth as well, calling it a healer as much as a meal. It strengthened blood, soothed the belly, and restored those weakened by long want. To them it was no weed, but a plant of the gods, placed in the north as a weapon against starvation. Though forgotten now, in the hunger years of the Vikings, it was nothing less than salvation. Warriors who lived to fight, mothers who lived to raise their children, skalds who lived to sing their sagas, many owed their survival to fat hen, the weed that became bread, the wild leaf that turned famine's curse into endurance. To bring it back would be to honour the plant that saved lives in silence, the green shield that guarded the Vikings through their darkest days. In the smoky longhouses of the north, where iron pots simmered over open flame and the air was thick with the scent of meat and barley, there was one herb that could command the whole kettle with but a sprig. This was lovage, a towering green that rose taller than a Viking child and carried a flavour so fierce it could tame even the heaviest stew. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, none held such fire in leaf and stem, for lovage was both feast and medicine, seasoning for the pot and healing for the body. To the Viking man, hardened by oar and axe, lovage was a warrior's herb. Its taste struck sharp and strong, a mingling of celery and parsley, but greater than both, as though the plant itself bore the fire of Thor's hammer. One stem could flavour an entire cauldron, and so it became prized in halls where provisions were precious. A hunter returning from the forest could add venison to the pot, yet it was lovage that gave the broth its life, filling the air with strength and stirring the blood of those who drank it. The Viking woman knew its worth not only for taste but for healing. Its leaves, crushed and brewed into tea, soothed the stomach after meals of salted fish and heavy bread. Its seeds, ground fine, were mixed into bread and ale, carrying their sharp heat into the body to cleanse and strengthen. Even its thick roots were boiled and eaten like parsnips, their sweetness softened by cooking. With one plant she could season her household, cure their ills, and keep them strong against the trials of winter. The Viking child, curious and bold, sometimes chewed its hollow stalks, sharp with oils that stung the tongue and cleared the breath. To them, it was not only strange food, but also plaything, a plant that grew taller than their heads, casting shadows across the garden. Its presence in the homestead was as constant as the smoke rising from the hearth, a living tower of green life that returned each spring, year after year. Lovage was also a plant of ritual. In monastery gardens it was grown for its virtues, but in the homes of the north it held a place beside sage and fennel as a herb of cleansing. Its scent was believed to drive out foul humours, its oils to purify the blood. Viking healers laid its leaves upon swelling, brewed its stems for fevers, and trusted its power to ease the body when toil and travel had worn it thin. In this way, it was more than flavour. It was a shield against sickness, a green guardian rooted in the soil. Its endurance was part of its wonder. Once planted, lovage could live for decades, towering higher each year, its stems thick as a warrior's wrist. It gave more than food. It gave continuity, a lasting ally that outlived storms, droughts, and even the hand that planted it. For a Viking family, such constancy was wealth beyond coin, for it meant strength renewed each spring without cost. Though forgotten now, lovage was once the fire in Viking food, the green that healed, flavoured, and endured. To restore it would be to restore the sharp taste of the north itself, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, a single herb could carry the warmth of life. Stronger than celery, fiercer than parsley, lovage was the herb of the Vikings' flame in the kettle, balm to the body, and a lasting companion in the saga of survival. In the world of the Vikings, where every plant was measured by its strength to heal or to sustain, lovage stood tall as both feast and cure. Rising higher than a Viking child, its stems hollow yet brimming with oils, its leaves sharp with a fire unlike any other green, this plant became as much a healer as a flavouring. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, lovage is among the most noble, for it carried power in every part, brightening mead with its bold taste, and soothing weary bodies with its hidden medicine. To the Viking man, weary from the salt winds of the sea, or from swinging axe in battle, lovage offered strength disguised as flavour. When dropped into a kettle of boiling meat, its scent filled the hall, lifting the hearts of warriors who sat hungry and tired by the fire. But its reach did not stop at the hearth. In the horn of mead, lovage was steeped to sharpen the drink, its bitterness mixing with honey's sweetness until the brew carried a strength unlike any other. To drink lovage mead was to feel warmth course through the body, fire in the belly, and vigour in the veins, a draught fit for men who would take up arms or raise sails at dawn. For the Viking woman, keeper of both table and remedy, lovage was a companion she trusted above most. She hung its stems to dry beside the rafters, ground its seeds into bread, and brewed its roots into strong teas for the sick. When children cried with fever, she placed warm infusions of lovage to their lips. When a Viking man returned from sea with his stomach churned from salted fish and stale bread, it was lovage tea that steadied him. The plant was more than seasoning, it was her healer's hand. The Viking child may not have understood its worth, but he knew its presence. Its towering height made it a landmark in every garden, and its hollow stalks became playthings to chew and blow through, their taste sharp and biting. Yet even the youngest learned that this plant was not mere play. In times of sickness they drank its bitter tea, and in times of feast they tasted it in bread or mead. From childhood to age, lovage was stitched into the fabric of their lives. The healers and wise women revered it most of all. They knew its oils could drive away swelling, ease pain, and cleanse the blood. They steeped its roots for those troubled with kidneys, bound its leaves upon wounds, and praised it as a purifier of the body. To them, lovage was more than an herb. It was a safeguard, a green guardian sent from the earth to ward off the ills that crept unseen. Its dual nature, both feast and cure, made it one of the most treasured plants of the Viking world. In the feasting hall, it gave flavour and fire to broth, bread, and drink. In the sick room, it became balm and healer. Few plants could claim such power, and fewer still endured as long, for once planted, lovage returned year after year, as steadfast as the people who nurtured it. Now it has slipped from memory, its place taken by softer, weaker herbs, yet the Vikings knew its worth. To them, lovage was more than celery's cousin. It was a towering ally, one that lent its fire to the feast and its strength to the sick. To bring it back is to taste again the sharp vigour of the north, to drink the mead that once carried both joy and cure, and to honour a plant that gave endlessly to the Viking people. When the snows came heavy and the earth hardened beneath ice, Viking families looked to their stores with wary eyes. Barrels of salted fish, sacks of grain, and dwindling roots were the usual fare of winter's siege. Fresh greens were all but forgotten until spring returned. Yet there was one small plant, unassuming and often overlooked, that dared to rise even in the heart of the frost. This was corn salad, the winter leaf. Its name spoke of grain fields, yet it was no corn at all, only a tender green that grew wild among the stubble after harvest, a quiet oasis of life when the world seemed dead. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, corn salad was one of the most cherished, for it offered freshness in a season when the body cried out for it most. To the Viking man, hardened by salted meat and dried fish, the taste of corn salad was a revelation. Its leaves were mild, almost nutty, carrying none of the bitterness of harsher greens. After months of heavy, salted fare, this simple leaf tasted of renewal. Plucked fresh from the frozen ground, it was eaten raw in handfuls or laid into broths where it lent a bright edge to the kettle. It was food that did not weigh the belly, but awakened it, reminding the warrior of spring even as snow still blanketed the earth. The Viking woman knew its worth beyond flavour. She gathered the rosettes of green in winter's depths, weaving them into meals for her household. While her children gnawed on hard bread, she slipped the tender leaves into their bowls, giving them strength that dried grain alone could not provide. Rich in iron and vigour, corn salad kept sickness at bay when the dark months stretched on. To her, it was not only food, but proof that the gods still granted mercy even in the leanest season. Even the Viking child, weary of salted fare, found joy in its soft leaves. Their taste was gentle enough for the youngest mouths, their presence a marvel in a world of snow and smoke. To the children, it was like finding green treasure hidden in the white waste, a secret gift of the earth that made them believe spring was nearer than it was. What made corn salad precious was its resilience. It sprouted in autumn, after the harvest, growing quietly in the fields. and when the cold descended, it did not wither. It endured beneath frost, waiting to be plucked when all else had perished. A Viking farmer could step into a snowbound field and still gather it, his hands numbed by ice, yet bringing home a living green for his hearth. It was as if the land itself had left behind a secret store of hope, hidden in plain sight. Corn salad bore another kind of strength too, its ability to nourish without grandeur. It was not the food of feasts, nor was it sung in saga. No warrior toasted it in the hall, no skald wove it into verse. Yet without it, many would have faltered before the return of spring. It was quiet food, humble food, yet vital, an ally that worked in silence while louder provisions dwindled. Though forgotten now, corn salad once brought the Vikings through the dark months with its gentle, steadfast gift. To taste it was to taste endurance, to remember that life could grow even in the cruelest cold. Misunderstood in name, yet clear in purpose, corn salad was the winter leaf of the north, small, humble, and mighty, a green oasis in fields of snow. There was a herb in the Viking world that did not whisper, but shouted. Its scent filled the air like smoke from a fire. Its taste struck the tongue like iron and ash. This was tansy, the bitter strength of the north. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, tansy stood apart, for it was no gentle leaf nor mild root, but a fierce herb that demanded respect. Pungent and bold, it carried power enough to season feasts, preserve food through long winters, and heal the body when sickness struck. To the Viking man, seated in the longhouse with horn in hand, tansy was a taste he knew well. Chopped and stirred into rich puddings of egg, bread, and honey, its bitterness gave balance to the sweetness, turning simple fare into festival food. At spring feasts, tansy was baked into cakes and pies, its strong flavour a reminder of life's edge, that every sweetness must carry a sharpness, every joy a shadow. A warrior's tongue did not shrink from strength, and tansy's fire on the palate was as welcome as mead's warmth in the belly. The Viking woman, mistress of preservation, prized tansy for another gift. Its oils, fierce and enduring, held the power to guard food against spoil. Meats rubbed with tansy leaves lasted longer in storage, breads baked with its essence resisted decay. In an age without salt enough for all, or cold houses to store the plenty of autumn, such a gift was more than luxury, it was survival. Her hands, stained with flour and herb, used tansy not only to flavour but to protect, ensuring her household endured through the weeks when famine prowled. Even the Viking child came to know it, though its bitterness curled their tongues. They drank tansy infusions in the spring, given by careful mothers and healers, as a purge against worms and winter's lingering sickness. They might gag and grimace, yet they swallowed, for it was known that tansy's sharpness cleared the body, drove out what did not belong, and set the blood right for the labours of summer. To the young, it was a lesson that strength was not always sweet, and that healing often came with hardship. The healers and wise folk held it in highest regard. They saw in tansy a plant with dual faces, poison if taken too freely, medicine if measured with care. Brewed as tea, it soothed fever and eased joints worn from toil. Placed in poultices, it drew out swelling and guarded wounds. Its flowers, bright as the sun, were carried into homes to drive away flies and pests. In all these ways, tansy's bitterness was turned to blessing, its fierceness made to serve the people. Its presence at Viking feasts carried symbolism as well. While honey and mead filled cups, while meats roasted rich and savoury, tansy reminded all of the balance of life. Sweetness alone was folly, bitterness taught strength. To eat tansy was to accept that the north was harsh, that joy must always be tempered by endurance. It was an herb that mirrored the Viking soul itself, unyielding, sharp, enduring, and unwilling to be ignored. Though forgotten in our time, tansy once held a place of power in the Viking hall and hearth. It was food, it was medicine, It was shield against decay. Stronger than parsley, fiercer than sage, it was the herb that demanded respect and gave strength in return. To restore it would be to reclaim not just a flavour, but a reminder that true survival is never soft, and that sometimes it is the bitter strength that carries a people through the dark. Along the storm-beaten coasts of the north, where waves shattered against rock and salt clung heavy in the air, there grew a plant as hardy as the Vikings themselves. It was sea kale, rising from sand and shingle, its broad leaves bold against the spray. While most crops withered in such harshness, sea kale thrived, its roots anchoring deep, its leaves swelling rich with strength. Of the forgotten vegetables Vikings grew that need to come back, few spoke so clearly of the bond between sea and soil, for this coastal treasure gave nourishment to the raider, the farmer, and the child alike. The Viking man who bent his back to the oar knew its worth. Long voyages meant salted meat and dried fish, foods that filled the belly but drained the body. Yet, when sea kale was gathered and brought aboard, its leaves gave life back to weary blood. Rich in hidden strength, it shielded him from the wasting sickness that crept upon sailors who spent too long without the taste of green. To chew its crisp flesh was to feel vigour return to arms and legs, a gift from the shore that followed him across the waves. The Viking woman, watching over her household near the coast, gathered sea kale with practised hands. In spring, she blanched its tender shoots, cooking them like asparagus to bring freshness after the long famine months. In summer, she cut the broad leaves, boiling or roasting them into dishes that could fill hungry mouths. Even the roots, thick and white, were roasted in the hearth, giving food enough for her family when the fields offered little. She knew that this wild plant, growing unbidden along the shore, was as valuable as any crop she sowed in her garden. To the Viking child, sea kale was a marvel, a plant that grew where no other dared. They played along the beaches, chasing gulls and gathering driftwood, and in the same sands they saw the broad green leaves pushing through. When hunger gnawed, their mothers plucked and fed them the tender stems, teaching them that the sea did not give fish alone, but plants as well. In this way, sea kale became a part of their earliest memory of food, a link between the land and the ocean that shaped their lives. The healers, too, understood its hidden gift. Sea kale carried a strength few could name then, but all could feel it kept sickness away. Those who ate it stood firmer against the wasting fevers that plagued long winters and longer voyages. A Viking man who tasted sea kale before setting sail stood a better chance of returning strong. A Viking woman who fed it to her children gave them armour within their blood. Though they did not speak of it in measured words, they knew in their bones that this coastal plant was guardian as well as food. Sea kale asked nothing in return. It needed no careful tending, no plough, no seed sown by hand. It rose from the very edges of the sea, from soil salted by spray, thriving where most crops would wither. Its resilience mirrored the Viking spirit, unyielding, enduring, born to flourish in places where others faltered. It was a treasure not hoarded in chests of gold, but scattered freely along the shorelines, waiting for those wise enough to claim it. Forgotten now, sea kale once bound the Vikings to both land and sea. It gave them strength to row, courage to raid, and health enough to endure the long dark. To bring it back is to recall the coastal treasure that fed warriors and shielded them from weakness. A plant that rose from salt and sand to prove that even in the harshest of places, life could thrive, and with it, the Viking people themselves.